When have you seen karma come back with a nuclear vendetta? My older brother Chuck used to love tormenting my girlfriend Jenna. All because she'd had an abortion at 15 after getting assaulted. Everyone knew her story because nothing stayed secret in our small town, and Chuck loved telling me I was dating a worthless whore who was a murderer. He'd come to my apartment drunk and scream through the door that Jenna was garbage who'd burn in hell for killing an innocent child. "You're dating damaged goods who spread her legs then threw away the consequences," he'd yell, while Jenna sobbed in my arms. At family dinners, he'd tell our parents that Jenna was disgusting trash who'd contaminate our bloodline if I ever had kids with her. He stood up during church testimony and said God had shown him that women who get abortions were Satan's way of dragging good men to hell. "She's a baby killer who should have been the one to die instead," he told the whole congregation while pointing at us. Chuck worked at our dad's car dealership and preached to every customer about the sanctity of life. He organized protests outside the women's clinic and held up signs with pictures while screaming at scared teenage girls that they were murderers for considering abortion. He told the youth group that girls who had abortions were whores who would never be clean, no matter how much they prayed. When Jenna volunteered at the women's shelter, he showed up and told everyone there that she was a baby killer pretending to help women. But then Chuck got Abby pregnant. She was only 19 and worked at the coffee shop downtown. She came from a religious family who'd disown her if she had a baby without being married. Chuck told her she had to get an abortion immediately because he wasn't ruining his future for some stupid mistake. When Abby said she wanted to think about it, Chuck grabbed her shoulders and shook her, saying she was getting one whether she wanted it or not. "This is different because we have futures worth protecting," he told her, like her choice didn't matter at all. Abby decided to keep the baby and told everyone Chuck had tried to force her to have an abortion against her will. The same church ladies who used to nod along when Chuck called Jenna a murderer now crossed the street to avoid him. People started calling him a hypocrite and a fake Christian who only cared about controlling women's bodies when it wasn't his problem. The youth group kids he'd preached to about purity saw him screaming at Abby outside the coffee shop that she was ruining his life by not getting rid of it. His protest friends from the clinic banned him from their group, saying he was exactly the type of controlling man they were protecting women from. Our parents kicked Chuck out of the family business because customers refused to buy from someone who'd terrorize women for their choices, then try to force those same choices on others. Dad said Chuck had shown his true colors as someone who only pretended to have values. The church elders told him he was no longer welcome at services until he understood that his sin wasn't about abortion, but about hypocrisy and cruelty. Chuck had to move into a motel because his landlord was Abby's aunt, who evicted him immediately after hearing how he'd treated her niece. The whole town started treating Chuck exactly how he'd treated Jenna for years. Women would call him a hypocrite and abuser when he walked by, just like he used to call them murderers. The grocery store clerk told him they didn't serve men who try to control women's bodies. The bartender at his favorite spot said woman haters weren't welcome and made him leave in front of everyone. His own friends said he was disgusting for trying to force his will on that poor girl after terrorizing women for making their own choices. Chuck lost everything within 3 months, just like he'd tried to make Jenna lose everything. He couldn't get a job because everyone knew him as the hypocrite who harassed women, then tried to force one to do exactly what he'd condemned. He had to shop 2 towns over because local stores wouldn't serve him. People would quote his own hateful words back to him about hell and damnation. He'd become the town pariah he'd tried to make Jenna into, except she had done nothing wrong while he'd shown everyone exactly who he really was. Jenna and I got engaged, and the whole town was happy for us because they'd seen how strong she was through everything. People apologized to her for listening to Chuck's poison and said they should have defended her right to make her own choices. The same church that let Chuck humiliate her asked if she'd like to have our wedding there for free as their way of making amends. Chuck heard about our engagement and tried to come to my apartment, but I wouldn't let him in. He called me crying, saying his life was over and begging me to make people forgive him. They forgave Jenna because she never did anything wrong, but you spent years being cruel to women for your own power trip, I told him before hanging up. But then Abby called me yesterday with panic in her voice. Chuck came by saying if everyone's going to treat him like a monster, then he might as well be one, and I should warn you that he knows where your wedding is, and he said Jenna's not walking out of that church. My hands were shaking so bad, I almost dropped the phone after Abby hung up. I called Jenna right away and told her exactly what Chuck said about the church and her not walking out. She went quiet for a few seconds and I could hear her breathing get faster. "Do you think he means it this time?" she asked. I told her we couldn't risk it with someone who had nothing left to lose. She was already grabbing her keys to come to my apartment when I heard her lock clicking. We spent the next hour on speaker with Abby, going through every single detail of when Chuck showed up at her place. She kept her voice steady, but I could tell she was scared as she repeated his exact words about becoming the monster everyone thought he was. She told us he'd been drinking and his eyes looked wild, and he kept saying the same stuff over and over about how if everyone was going to treat him like trash, then he'd show them what trash really looked like. Abby said she'd write everything down and save any texts or calls from him, and she'd already taken a picture of the muddy footprints he left on her porch. After we hung up with Abby, I went around checking every lock twice while Jenna watched from the couch with her pepper spray in her hand. I grabbed a flashlight and walked around our whole apartment building looking for Chuck's beat-up Ford truck. My heart jumped every time I saw headlights coming down the street, but there was no sign of him anywhere. We decided we'd take turns sleeping tonight, with one of us always watching the street from the window. Neither of us said it out loud, but we both knew we probably wouldn't sleep much anyway. At 2 in the morning, I couldn't stand waiting anymore, so I called the police non-emergency number and explained everything to the woman who answered. She took down all the information about Chuck's threat and Abby's warning and gave me an incident number that started with 047 something. She said a detective would follow up in the morning and suggested we should vary our routines and maybe stay somewhere else for a few days if we could. I started going through my phone looking for all the crazy messages Chuck had sent over the past few months. There were 17 total, and each one got worse than the last. The first ones were just him calling me names for dating Jenna, but by the last few he was saying stuff about how we'd both pay for ruining his life. I took screenshots of everything and emailed copies to myself and to my work email, just to have backups. The next morning I texted Abby asking if she could send me a written statement about Chuck's visit and any proof she had of their past stuff. Within an hour, she sent me screenshots of his old texts, demanding she get an abortion, including one where he said he'd drag her there himself if he had to. She also typed up everything about his threat against Jenna, and sent that too. She said she was scared, but wanted to help keep Jenna safe after everything Chuck had put her through. Jenna and I were both exhausted from staying up all night taking turns watching the street. Every car that slowed down made us both tense up, and we'd already figured out 3 different ways to get out of the apartment if Chuck showed up. We knew which neighbor's fence we could jump and which cars we could hide behind and where the nearest public place was that would have people around. The tired feeling was worth it, though, if it meant we'd see him coming. Around noon, I finally called the church office and asked for Marlena Wainwright, who ran everything there. I explained Chuck's threat and asked about security for our wedding, and it felt weird asking for help from the same place that let him humiliate Jenna in front of everyone. But Marlena sounded really concerned and said she'd been hoping we'd still have the wedding there after everything that happened. She scheduled a meeting for 3 that afternoon to talk about safety stuff. The police called back and gave us a referral to someone named Rosalind Atwood, who was a domestic violence advocate who knew about threat assessment. We met her at the police station that same day, and she started asking all kinds of practical questions about whether Chuck had guns and what his mental state was like. She wanted to know if he'd ever been violent before and whether he had friends who might help him. Her calm way of talking helped me stop feeling so panicked. Rosalind told us we needed to go completely dark on social media about the wedding and take down any posts that mentioned when or where it was happening. It felt wrong to hide our happiness because of Chuck, but Jenna agreed it was better than giving him information he could use. We spent the next hour going through Facebook and Instagram, deleting anything about the wedding or even posts that showed where we liked to hang out. We unfriended anyone we didn't completely trust and made all our profiles private. Rosalind said predators use social media to track their targets, and we couldn't give Chuck any advantages. The next morning, a detective named Stephen Pike called and said he'd been assigned to our case after reviewing everything we'd sent in. He came to the apartment around 10 and spread out all our screenshots and documents on the kitchen table while asking detailed questions about Chuck's behavior patterns. Pike had handled cases like this before, where someone lost everything and decided to take revenge on whoever they blamed. He looked at each piece of evidence carefully and started organizing them into different piles based on dates and types of threats. After 2 hours of going through everything he said, we had enough for a restraining order, but warned us that paper doesn't stop bullets. Pike took me down to the station that afternoon to file the formal police report, and I brought all of Abby's written statements, plus the screenshots she'd sent. The detective had me write out every incident I could remember with Chuck, including dates and witnesses, while Jenna sat next to me squeezing my hand whenever I had to describe the worst threats. Pike said having this paper trail was crucial because it showed a pattern of escalation that judges take seriously. After we finished at the station, Rosalind met us back at the apartment to create what she called a comprehensive safety plan. She had us pick code words that meant different things, like one for calling 911 immediately and another for meeting at a safe location we'd chosen in advance. She programmed the domestic violence hotline into both our phones and made us save it under a fake contact name in case Chuck ever got hold of them. Then she spent an hour teaching Jenna some basic self-defense moves like how to break a grip and where to strike if someone grabs her. We practiced the moves over and over until they started feeling less awkward, though neither of us felt confident we could actually use them if needed. Rosalind also helped us identify safe places along our regular routes where we could run if Chuck showed up, like stores that were always busy or buildings with security guards. The next day, we had an appointment with Kathleen Weiss from Legal Aid, who specialized in protective orders and domestic violence cases. She went through all our documentation page by page and said Chuck's explicit threats combined with his pattern of harassment made for a strong case. The paperwork for the protective order was overwhelming with questions about every aspect of our relationship with Chuck and detailed descriptions of each incident. Kathleen helped us fill out each form correctly and explained what would happen at the hearing, including what questions the judge might ask. That same afternoon, we drove to the church to meet with Marlena Wainwright about security for the wedding. She listened to everything that had happened and immediately started proposing different safety measures without making us feel like we were overreacting. She suggested moving the ceremony to their smaller chapel that only had 2 entrances instead of the main sanctuary with its 6 different doors. The smaller space would also make it easier to spot anyone who didn't belong, and she offered to keep the actual ceremony time secret from everyone except immediate family and the wedding party. She even proposed having the ushers arrive early to watch for Chuck's truck in the parking lot and said they could lock the doors once the ceremony started. When I got home that evening, I knew I had to tell our parents something about what was happening, even though I didn't want to worry them. I called them and explained that Chuck had made some threats about the wedding and we were taking legal precautions, but I kept the worst details to myself. Mom started crying immediately, and Dad's jaw clenched so tight I could hear it through the phone, but they both agreed not to contact Chuck since it might make things worse. They promised to help with anything we needed, including money for security or legal fees. 3 days later, Kathleen met us at the courthouse to file for the temporary protective order, and we sat in the hallway for 2 hours, waiting for our turn with the judge. When we finally got called in, the judge reviewed all our evidence, including Chuck's texts and Abby's statement about his threat against Jenna. The judge asked a few questions about whether we felt in immediate danger, and then granted the temporary order right there, saying the evidence clearly showed a credible threat of violence. Having that legal protection on paper made my chest feel less tight, even though I knew Pike was right about paper not stopping someone determined to hurt us. We'd barely gotten home from court when my phone buzzed with a long text from Chuck that jumped between apologizing for everything and blaming everyone else for ruining his life. Right in the middle of his rambling, he mentioned knowing exactly when and where our wedding was happening, which made my blood run cold. I immediately forwarded the text to Detective Pike, who called back within minutes saying Chuck had just violated the protective order we'd gotten 3 hours ago. Pike said he'd add this to the file, and it would strengthen our case for the permanent order at the full hearing. That same evening, someone sent us screenshots of a post Chuck had made on social media about people treating him like a monster and how everyone would get what they deserved. 3 different people had seen it and sent it to us within minutes of him posting it, and we forwarded everything to Pike immediately. The detective said our evidence file was getting thick enough to show a clear pattern of escalation and violation of the court order. The next morning, Abby called to say she was ready to give her full statement to the police about Chuck trying to force her to get an abortion. She met with Detective Pike that afternoon and provided a detailed timeline, including the date he first demanded she terminate the pregnancy and the names of 2 people who witnessed him screaming at her outside the coffee shop. She even had texts where he threatened to drag her to the clinic himself if she didn't go willingly, and one where he said he'd make her life hell if she kept the baby. Pike told us later that Abby's testimony would be crucial for showing Chuck's pattern of trying to control women through threats and intimidation. 2 days later, we were at the grocery store when Jenna suddenly grabbed my arm so hard it hurt. She was staring at a blue truck in the parking lot, and her whole body started shaking. Her breathing got fast and shallow, while tears ran down her face. I remembered what Rosalind taught us about panic attacks and guided Jenna toward the back exit. We left our cart full of food and went straight through the stockroom doors. The workers looked confused, but I kept moving Jenna toward the loading dock. We got to our car, and I locked the doors while Jenna called the police with shaking hands. The dispatcher sent an officer to check the truck while we waited in the car. 20 minutes later, the officer called back saying it was just someone else with the same model truck. Jenna was still shaking even after we got home, and it took hours for her to calm down. The next morning, I went to my boss's office and explained the whole situation with Chuck. I asked if I could work from home and adjust my schedule to drive Jenna to work. My boss listened without interrupting, then said he understood and approved the changes immediately. He gave me a laptop and said I could work whatever hours made sense. I felt bad about making everyone adjust, but keeping Jenna safe was more important. That same week, the security guard at my office building called me into his booth. He showed me footage from 3 different cameras of Chuck's truck, driving slowly past the building. The timestamps showed he'd circled the block 3 times over 40 minutes yesterday afternoon. The guard had already written down Chuck's license plate and saved all the footage to a flash drive. He said my coworkers had been watching for the truck too, after I'd told them about the situation. We added this new evidence to the growing stack of documentation we were collecting for court. Rosalind came to our apartment that evening and helped us set up a group text with our neighbors. She explained how neighborhood watch systems work and what everyone should look for. All 6 neighbors on our floor agreed to watch for Chuck's truck and report anything suspicious. We picked the code word Red Alert, which meant everyone should call 911 immediately. Our elderly neighbor said she was home all day and would keep watch from her window. The couple next door offered to walk us to our cars if we ever felt unsafe. Having everyone working together made us feel less alone in dealing with Chuck. 3 days later, we were back in court for the emergency protective order hearing. The judge spent 30 minutes reviewing all our evidence, including the new security footage and neighbor statements. She asked us several questions about how scared we were and what Chuck had said. Then she signed the order that legally banned Chuck from coming within 500 feet of us. Kathleen explained that violating the order meant automatic arrest, but warned us it was still just paper. The protection was only as good as Chuck's willingness to follow it and the police response time. The next morning, the process server tracked Chuck down at the motel where he'd been living. The motel manager stood in the doorway watching as the server handed Chuck the court papers. Chuck started screaming and threw the papers on the ground while cursing at everyone. The manager pulled out her phone and recorded the whole thing, including Chuck kicking the papers. She sent us the video that afternoon, and we forwarded it straight to Detective Pike. This was more proof that Chuck wasn't handling things well and might do something stupid. That night, Jenna got a message on social media from an account with no profile picture. It said her wedding would be ruined, and she'd regret everything she'd done to destroy Chuck's life. The account was created that same day and had no other activity or connections. Detective Pike traced the IP address and found it came from the public library's computers. He pulled the library's security footage, which showed Chuck using that exact computer at that exact time. Pike added cyberstalking to the list of charges they were building against Chuck. Meanwhile, Marlena called us about new security plans for the wedding. She'd removed our announcement from the church bulletin so random people wouldn't know the details. She was making a strict guest list and hiring someone to check names at the door. Only people we specifically approved would be allowed inside the church that day. She'd also hired an off-duty police officer to patrol the parking lot during the ceremony. The church elders had voted to pay for all the security measures as their apology. The next day, my parents got a voicemail from Chuck that lasted almost 5 minutes. He blamed them for choosing us over him and said they'd abandoned their own son. He said they were terrible parents who'd thrown him away when he needed family most. Dad wanted to call Chuck back and try to talk sense into him. I convinced him that any contact would just make Chuck angrier and give him hope. We saved the voicemail and sent it to Detective Pike as more evidence of harassment. That weekend, Jenna packed a bag and went to stay with her friend from the shelter. I used those 2 days to meet with contractors about upgrading our apartment security. We installed new deadbolts on both doors that couldn't be picked or bumped. The contractor put in a full security system with sensors on every window and door. We mounted cameras to cover the front door, back door, and parking area. The whole system cost almost $3,000, but I didn't care about the money. When Jenna came back, she cried seeing all the new security, but said she felt safer. The next few days, we started doing everything different like Detective Pike told us, taking the long way to work one day and cutting through side streets the next. Jenna would leave for work 10 minutes early on Monday, then 20 minutes late on Tuesday, while I parked in different spots at my office every morning. We stopped going to our usual coffee place at the same time and started buying groceries at random stores across town instead of our regular place. It felt stupid at first, but Pike said people like Chuck watch for patterns, and the best defense was being unpredictable. Even our walks became planned out with 3 different routes we'd pick at random using dice rolls. The whole thing was exhausting because we had to think about every single move we made outside the apartment. 3 nights later, I woke up to my car alarm going off and ran to the window to see someone running away from my car. The new cameras we'd installed caught everything, including a tall figure in a hoodie, slashing all 4 of my tires with what looked like a hunting knife. The person's height and build matched Chuck exactly, even though the hood covered their face. I called 911 while watching the footage again, and the responding officer said this was serious escalation from harassment to property damage. Detective Pike came by the next morning to review the footage himself and said Chuck was getting desperate, which made him more dangerous. The auto shop owner, who'd known our family for 20 years, towed my car and fixed all 4 tires for free after hearing what happened. He said anyone who'd terrorize women didn't deserve to profit from their crimes, and he wanted to help however he could. Pike started having patrol cars drive by our apartment every 2 hours during the day and every hour at night. Seeing those police cars should have made us feel safe, but instead, they were constant reminders that we were living under threat from my own brother. The officers would wave when they saw us at the window, and we'd wave back, grateful for their presence, even if it meant accepting we needed protection. 2 days later, Detective Pike called saying Abby's aunt had come forward with important information about Chuck's eviction. She'd kept detailed records of everything, including photos of the 3 holes Chuck punched in her walls when she told him to leave. She had pictures of the bedroom door he'd kicked in and the bathroom mirror he'd smashed with his fist. Her written statement described Chuck screaming that he'd make everyone pay for ruining his life and that Abby was a lying whore who'd destroyed him. She'd also recorded him on her phone throwing furniture and breaking dishes while she waited outside for the police to arrive. All this documentation got added to the growing file Pike was building to show Chuck's pattern of violence and escalation. The court clerk called that afternoon saying they'd scheduled our hearing for a permanent protective order in 3 days. Kathleen said this was faster than usual, because the judge had reviewed our evidence and considered Chuck an immediate threat. She warned us we'd have to testify about how Chuck's harassment had affected our lives, and his lawyer would try to make it seem like normal family drama. The thought of sitting in the same room as Chuck made my stomach turn, but we needed the court's protection to be permanent, not just temporary. We spent 6 hours at Kathleen's office going through every piece of evidence, in order from the first threatening text to the slashed tires. She had us practice answering questions without getting emotional or angry, because Chuck's lawyer would try to make us look unstable or vindictive. We went over the timeline again and again, until we could recite every date and incident without hesitation. Kathleen showed us how to stay calm when the defense tried to twist our words or minimize Chuck's actions as misunderstandings. She taught us to answer only what was asked, without volunteering extra information that could be used against us. By the time we left her office, my head was pounding, but we felt ready to face whatever Chuck's lawyer might throw at us. Rosalind met with Jenna and Abby separately the next day to help them prepare emotionally for testifying. She taught them breathing exercises to use if they started feeling panicked and grounding techniques to stay present if the questions got too intense. With Jenna, she focused on not letting Chuck's presence re-traumatize her and remembering she was safe with deputies in the room. For Abby, she worked on building confidence to speak her truth without shame about the pregnancy or Chuck's attempts to control her. Both women practiced their testimony multiple times, with Rosalind playing the role of a hostile defense attorney, trying to break them down. After each session, Abby seemed stronger and more determined to make sure the court understood exactly who Chuck really was. Meanwhile, Marlena arranged a meeting with the church elders about wedding security, since Chuck had made specific threats about the ceremony. They agreed to lock every door except the main entrance during the service, and have 2 ushers stationed at each exit watching for Chuck. The elders apologized again for not stopping Chuck's harassment of Jenna years ago and said they wanted to do everything possible to keep her safe now. They voted to hire private security for the wedding at the church's expense and to remove our ceremony details from all public announcements. The morning of the hearing arrived, and we walked into the courthouse to find Chuck already sitting at the defendant's table glaring at us. His lawyer looked tired and frustrated, like he'd already tried talking sense into Chuck without success. We sat at our table with Kathleen while Abby took a seat in the witness section, looking pale but determined. The judge reviewed our evidence for 20 minutes, reading through threatening texts and looking at photos of property damage. When it was time for testimony, Abby went first, describing Chuck's threats in a clear, steady voice that only shook a little. She told the court about him grabbing her and shaking her while demanding she get an abortion, about him saying he'd force her if she didn't comply. Jenna submitted a written statement about the mental health impact of Chuck's harassment, because Rosalind said she didn't have to testify in person if it would re-traumatize her. Chuck's lawyer barely asked any questions after seeing our mountain of documentation and witness statements. He tried to suggest this was just a family disagreement that got out of hand, but the judge cut him off, saying threats of violence weren't family disagreements. When the judge granted the 1-year protective order, Chuck jumped up and started screaming that we were all liars who'd destroyed his life. He cursed at the judge, calling her a stupid bitch who didn't understand real family values. 2 deputies grabbed Chuck's arms as he tried to lunge toward our table, yelling that we'd regret this. The judge cited him for contempt of court and ordered him held for 72 hours, while adding that any violation of the protective order would result in immediate arrest. Chuck kept screaming that we'd ruined everything and he'd make us pay as the deputies dragged him out of the courtroom. We stayed at the courthouse for another hour, filling out paperwork, while the deputies processed Chuck for contempt. Detective Pike walked us to our car and said he'd call if anything changed, but Chuck would be held for at least 3 days. That night, we actually slept without checking the windows every 20 minutes. The next morning, Detective Pike called saying Chuck made bail through some friend from his old protest group who still believed his act. Chuck had to wear a GPS ankle monitor and couldn't come within 500 feet of us or contact us through anyone else. The detective said the monitor would ping if Chuck got too close, but warned us technology wasn't perfect and we should stay alert. 2 days later, I was getting coffee downtown when someone I knew from high school walked up to me. He said Chuck asked him to tell me he was sorry and wanted to make things right. I told him that was a violation of the protective order and he could get arrested for helping Chuck contact us. The guy went pale and started apologizing, saying he didn't know about the court order. I called Detective Pike right there, and the guy agreed to give a statement about Chuck asking him to deliver messages. The next day, the detective called saying the guy gave him screenshots of Chuck messaging at least 6 other people, trying to get them to contact us for him. Each message was another violation, and the charges were piling up fast. 3 days after that, Detective Pike called with worse news. Chuck tried to buy a gun at the sporting goods store, but got flagged when they ran the background check because of the protective order. The owner knew our family and called the cops right away. The detective said trying to buy a weapon while under a protective order was serious, and they were scheduling an emergency hearing to revoke his bail. Meanwhile, Marlena from the church called and said she'd quietly booked us a backup venue at a small chapel across town under a fake name. Only she, Jenna, and I knew about it in case we needed to switch locations last minute. Having that backup plan helped us sleep a little better, even though we still jumped at every noise. We held our wedding rehearsal with just our closest friends and explained all the safety stuff we'd need. We had code words for different situations and showed everyone the emergency exits. Our friends took it seriously and promised to get there early to help watch the doors. Seeing how protective everyone was made Jenna tear up. 2 mornings later, the security cameras at Jenna's work caught Chuck's truck in the parking lot at 6 in the morning before they opened. The GPS data showed he sat there for 40 minutes just watching the building. Police got there fast and gave him a formal warning while documenting another violation. His ankle monitor confirmed exactly where he was and for how long. That same afternoon, Abby's mom called us out of nowhere. Her family had wanted nothing to do with the whole situation at first, but seeing Chuck get more dangerous changed their minds. Her mom said she'd come to any court hearings we needed, and her dad would drive Abby to appointments so she'd be safe. Having her family finally support us felt like another wall of protection. That night, Jenna and I sat on our couch talking for hours about whether we should just postpone the wedding until Chuck was locked up. We went back and forth, but finally decided we weren't going to let his threats control our lives anymore. We'd take every precaution, but our love didn't have to wait for perfect safety. The very next day, Chuck posted a photo on social media showing the front of our church with yesterday's date and timestamp. Detective Pike called within an hour saying that was another clear violation since Chuck wasn't supposed to be anywhere near the church. The detective was filing to revoke Chuck's bail based on all these violations and said the judge would probably agree this time. Chuck kept breaking the rules faster than the court system could process them, but at least they were finally taking it seriously. Each violation added more charges and made it harder for Chuck to claim this was all a misunderstanding. The GPS data, the gun store incident, the messages to people, the workplace stalking, and now the church photo all painted a clear picture of someone who wouldn't stop. Detective Pike said he'd never seen someone violate a protective order so many times so fast. We kept all the evidence organized in a folder that got thicker every day. Our friends checked in constantly, and neighbors watched for Chuck's truck. The whole town seemed to be helping protect us from him. Even people who barely knew us offered to help with security or let us stay at their houses. The church elders met again and voted to hire 2 more security guards for the wedding. Marlena gave us a direct phone line that would reach her immediately if anything happened. Every safety measure we added made us feel a little more in control, even though we knew Chuck was getting more desperate. The backup venue stayed our secret, and we even did a practice run to see how fast we could get there if needed. Abby kept sending us updates about Chuck trying to contact her too, which we forwarded to Detective Pike as more evidence. Her courage in documenting everything while pregnant amazed us. The prosecutor said our case file was one of the most complete he'd ever seen. We just wanted it to be over, but knew we had to be patient and let the legal system work, even though it felt too slow. The next morning, Detective Pike called saying the judge had signed the arrest warrant based on all of Chuck's violations, and they'd have him in custody soon. He told us to stay somewhere safe until Chuck was picked up, since desperate people do desperate things when they know cops are coming. We packed overnight bags and drove to Jenna's friend's house on the other side of town, where Chuck wouldn't think to look for us. I kept checking my phone every few minutes, waiting for news, while Jenna paced around the living room, unable to sit still. Her friend made us tea, but neither of us could drink it because our stomachs were too tight with worry. Around midnight, we tried to sleep on the pull-out couch, but every car that passed made us jump, thinking it might be Chuck or the police. At 3 in the morning, I got up and checked all the locks again, even though I'd already done it 5 times. Jenna finally fell asleep around 4, but I stayed awake watching the street through the blinds. My phone rang at 5:30, and Detective Pike's name made my heart race as I answered. He said they'd found Chuck sleeping in his truck at a rest stop 2 towns over and arrested him without any problems. The relief hit me so hard I had to sit down on the floor while Jenna woke up asking what was happening. I told her Chuck was in custody, and she started crying and hugging me, so tight I could barely breathe. We called Abby right away, and she answered on the first ring like she'd been waiting by her phone too. She started sobbing when I told her Chuck was locked up and kept saying thank you over and over. I called Marlena next to let her know we could use the original church venue since the immediate threat was gone. She said she'd notify everyone involved in security and adjust the plans back to what we'd originally wanted. The wedding was only 3 days away, and suddenly it felt real instead of something we might have to cancel. We went back to our apartment that afternoon, and it felt strange not having to check for Chuck's truck first. Jenna started trying on her dress again and actually smiled for the first time in weeks. I watched her spin around in front of the mirror and felt like maybe we'd actually get our happy day after all. The morning of our wedding arrived sunny and warm, which felt like a good sign after all the darkness. Jenna got ready at her mom's house while I put on my suit at our apartment, trying not to think about Chuck. The church looked beautiful, with flowers everywhere, and only the people we really wanted there filling the small chapel. When the music started and Jenna walked down the aisle, she wasn't looking over her shoulder or gripping her dad's arm in fear. She looked right at me and smiled the whole way, like we were the only two people in the room. The off-duty officer Marlena had hired stood in the back, but reported absolutely nothing unusual happening all day. After we said our vows and kissed, everyone cheered louder than I'd ever heard in that little church. The pastor made an announcement after the ceremony that caught us both by surprise. He said the church wanted to publicly acknowledge their failure to protect Jenna from Chuck's harassment years ago. They were implementing new policies for handling any harassment during services and would train all staff about domestic violence awareness. He said it was too late to help us, but they wanted to prevent anyone else from suffering what we went through. The church posted the statement on their website and social media that same day for everyone to see. At our reception, Abby showed up with her parents and two brothers acting as security, which showed incredible bravery. She was starting to show her pregnancy and looked tired, but determined to celebrate with us, despite everything. The other guests welcomed her with open arms, and several people told her how brave she was for speaking up. She hugged Jenna for a long time and whispered that seeing us happy gave her hope that her baby would grow up in a better world. Everyone danced and laughed, and for a few hours we forgot about protective orders and arrests and fear. 3 days after the wedding, Kathleen called saying she was filing a victim impact statement with the prosecutor's office. She documented every single way Chuck's actions had affected not just us, but Abby and our families and the whole community. She recommended the maximum penalties and mandatory psychological evaluation before he could ever be released. The prosecutor called us later saying he was taking the case very seriously and would push for real consequences. Detective Pike came by our apartment the next week to return all our evidence files and debrief us about ongoing safety. He gave us resources for security planning and reminded us to stay alert, even with Chuck locked up. He said in 30 years of police work, he'd rarely seen someone violate a protective order so many times so fast. We thanked him for taking us seriously from the beginning, when other cops might have called it family drama. Jenna made an appointment with a trauma specialist the following week to start processing everything that had happened. She said she was ready to work through not just Chuck's recent threats, but also the original harassment from years ago. I drove her to the first appointment and waited in the car while she went inside looking nervous, but determined. When she came out an hour later, her eyes were red, but she said it felt good to finally talk to someone who understood trauma. I booked my own counseling sessions because the stress and guilt about my brother was eating me up inside. The therapist helped me understand that protecting Jenna didn't mean I'd failed Chuck as a brother. She said setting boundaries with toxic family members wasn't abandonment, but self-preservation and love for the family I was building with Jenna. 2 weeks after our wedding, Abby called to say she'd met with legal aid about custody arrangements for when the baby came. The lawyer helped her file paperwork establishing that Chuck couldn't have unsupervised visits with the child once it was born. She sent me copies of everything she'd filed showing how she was already protecting her baby from Chuck's influence. Her voice sounded stronger every time we talked, and she'd stopped apologizing for telling us about Chuck's threats. The legal aid office connected her with resources for single mothers, including housing assistance and job training programs. She was taking parenting classes at the community center and had already picked out a crib from the thrift store. Meanwhile, Marlena from church called asking if we'd help review new safety protocols she was writing based on what happened with Chuck. She came to our apartment with a draft policy about handling threats during services and protecting vulnerable members. We spent 3 hours going through every scenario we could think of, while she took notes and asked questions. The policy included things like designated safety officers and evacuation plans and mandatory reporting of threats. She added sections about supporting victims and not allowing public humiliation during testimony time. The church board voted on it the next Sunday, and everyone raised their hands to approve the changes. My parents started calling every Wednesday to check how we were doing without mentioning Chuck's name. Dad would ask about work, and Mom would talk about the garden, but really they were making sure we felt safe. They sent a check to help with the security system we'd installed, and offered to pay for Jenna's therapy sessions. Mom dropped off groceries sometimes saying she'd bought too much, but we knew she was taking care of us. Their quiet support meant everything after the chaos of the past months. Then the prosecutor called saying Chuck's lawyer wanted to discuss a plea deal to avoid trial. The terms included 3 years probation with anger management classes and mandatory therapy twice a week. Chuck would have to stay out of our town for 5 years and have zero contact with us or Abby. The prosecutor said trials were hard on victims, and this deal would guarantee consequences without us testifying. Jenna and I talked it over and decided we'd rather have certainty than risk a trial where Chuck might get off. We told the prosecutor we'd support the deal if the judge approved strict monitoring. 3 days later, we sat in court while the judge reviewed the plea agreement with Chuck standing at the defense table. The judge made Chuck acknowledge each violation and confirm he understood the consequences of breaking probation. Chuck had to pay restitution for our security costs and the damage to my tires plus court fees. The judge warned him that any violation would mean immediate prison time with no second chances. Chuck nodded and signed the papers, while his lawyer whispered instructions in his ear. After court, we drove 2 hours to a cabin I'd rented for a delayed honeymoon getaway. For 3 days, we hiked trails and cooked meals and sat by the fire without checking windows. We kept our phones on, but nobody called with emergencies or warnings about Chuck. The first morning I woke up without immediately checking the locks felt strange but good. Jenna actually slept through the whole night without nightmares for the first time in months. We came back feeling like maybe we could have a normal life after everything. A month later, Abby texted us a grainy ultrasound photo showing her baby's profile. She'd joined a support group for single moms that met at the shelter where Jenna volunteered. Several women from the group had offered to be her birth coaches when the time came. She was working extra shifts at the coffee shop to save money for baby supplies. Her parents had come around and were helping her convert their spare room into a nursery. She'd chosen the name Sarah if it was a girl, and Michael if it was a boy. The baby was healthy and growing right on schedule according to her doctor. 6 months passed and life settled into new patterns where checking locks was habit, but not panic. Chuck was living 3 states away in mandated therapy and working at a warehouse to pay his restitution. Abby had her baby, a girl named Sarah, surrounded by her chosen family of support group friends. The church's new safety protocols had helped 2 other families dealing with harassment situations. My parents came for Sunday dinners, and we talked about normal things like work and weather. Jenna and I painted the spare bedroom yellow and started talking about maybe having kids someday. The protective order was still active, but we'd stopped jumping at every unexpected sound. Our marriage was built on protecting each other through the worst time, and now we were learning to live without constant fear. Well, that's the dramatic ending you didn't know you needed. If you're still here, I'm equal parts impressed and concerned. Might as well subscribe and see what happens next.